Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international relations. Ever since Russia intervened in Ukraine, some call it military intervention, some call it the beginning of a war, the power equations have been changing very fast. And nowhere they have changed faster than in Europe, because this is a major European war in past 70 years, ever since the Second World War ended, and it has portents of expanding into maybe an all-destructive nuclear holocaust, the Third World War, which will be madness for anybody to encourage. But that's what we are faced with. And in this context, what is most important is to see how the major European powers have reacted to it and how this is going to impact on their relationship with one another. How is the European Union going to manage foreign policy responses as a unified grouping of nations? How is NATO going to respond to it? And what implications it has for India's foreign policy. There are other developments also, not unrelated to this, but we have been so focused on whatever is happening in the battlefront in Ukraine that we have had little time to analyze at length what is the implication elsewhere. The Japanese Prime Minister's recent visit to India and his saying that Japan understands India's position on the Russian intervention in Ukraine, but also insisting that the primary focus of Japan, India, Australia, and of course USA remains what the origin objective of Quads was, that China's expansionist drive towards South China Sea, and nothing on the European front should be allowed to distract from it. These are issues which we have to worry about on the international arena. There also have been developments which are taking place closer home. The Pakistanis are having another inkling that a period of unrest and instability might follow. The Pakistani Prime Minister is confronted with the challenge of coping with a no-confidence motion. His own party members have started defecting. The coalition has been very weak. He is trying to play various factions against the other, trying to secure army support for another extended spell. So far in Pakistan, no elected Prime Minister has completed a term in office. So is he going to break this jinx, or is he also going to have vacate office? And what again are the likely consequences for India we have to worry about. Another neighbor in the neighborhood, Sri Lanka, has been beset with grave economic difficulties, and it is becoming from worst to worst, from bad to worse and worse to worst. And India has been trying to extend a line of credit, etc. So we have challenges both on the international arena and in the immediate neighborhood and the proximate neighborhood. There are other interesting issues which we shall discuss with you this time. Let us take a look at Germany first of all. Germany is the largest economy in the European Union, and it is dependent for its energy securities on import of gas from Russia. And that is the reason why it has been dragging its feet about putting a check to the advances, the aggressive postures of President Putin. It took some time before it made up its mind under American persuasion to put in suspension the Nord 2 stream under the sea pipeline, which was supposed to bypass Ukraine and bring the gas straight to Germany and to other countries in Europe. So this is a multi-billion-dollar project which Russia had set great hopes on, and this seems to displease the Russians a little. The Russians have not issued threats, but the Russians have said that the Europeans should realize that they should not do the bidding of USA in a manner which hurts their own interests, besides trying to hurt Russia. The economic sanctions imposed on Russia have made Russia dependent on the earning of foreign exchange earning from its gas exports, and its boycott from the SWIFT system means that it is out of the dollar system. So major part of its foreign exchange earnings were getting from European euros, and this seems to have been put in jeopardy because of the Germans now turning the screws on the Nord 2 stream. The problem is that the Russians can also retaliate. If the Russians retaliate, they can cut down their supply of gas to Europe, especially to Germany, and the Germany would be paying a high price for this. There would be social unrest, the price of energy would go up, and the winter, by the time the winter comes, life would be miserable in Germany. Germany has also made it very clear that it doesn't think it is possible to cut back its imports from Russia, gas imports from Russia, for the next 4 to 5 years. They will be slowly phased back. The German population also is worried that the Americans are comfortable with their own gas and petroleum fuel resources in their own country, and they are leaving their European allies into a lurch. Now, this is one part. The other part which makes life more complicated for the Germans is that the new German Chancellor Scholz does not match Angela Merkel in stature, who had a special personal relationship. Not that special personal relationships matter very much in international relations beyond a point, but there is still a possibility of a dialogue, some gesture of goodwill, etc., which is no longer possible with the new Chancellor immediately. She herself was a refugee from East Germany. She was more sympathetic to the refugee problem. She had been brought up in the socialistic system, and Putin also thought that she understood what the compulsions were of the Soviet system, later the Russian system, and there could be a possibility of a more meaningful dialogue more mature dialogue between these two. Also, the foreign minister of Germany at the moment belongs to the Green Party, and she is committed to green energy resources. So this also puts an immediate pressure on the German Chancellor to balance. Germany has already started looking for alternative sources of energy. The German energy minister recently toured UAE, and he is trying to secure gas from sources other than maybe from Qatar, maybe from UAE. So this is one part of the problem which Germany has had to do, balancing the likelihood of the Russian supplies of gas not being assured in coming days. It may say that it will phase out in 5 years, but Putin might decide to teach the Germans a lesson, put the pressure on them and say, look, if you are not willing to deal with us, then learn to live without Russian gas at all. The other thing is, the military events in Ukraine have forced Germany rethink about its security expenditure and its defense expenditure. This is something which Trump had been arguing for a long time, telling the Germans and also the other European allies that they should pull their own weight for their own security arrangements. They should not depend on NATO all along. They should not depend on US to provide them security cover, and keep thinking in terms of developing their economies. So Germany so far had not spent more than 1.5% of its GDP for its defense expenditure. Now it has declared that it is going to undertake a multi-billion-dollar expenditure, and its share of its GDP for defense expenditure would rise immediately to 2%. Now this is what the Americans had been encouraging them, prompting them to do so. So the events in Ukraine have resulted in Germany increasing its military expenditure. The German behavior in the security environment is also curious in another aspect. The Germans, after their humiliating defeat in the Second World War, had been not emasculated as badly as the Japanese, but when they were reintegrated, Germany was reunified, they still were supposed to be of restraint to assure their neighbors in European Union that their designs were no longer aggressive, and German military might should not be looked at as threatening by any smaller neighbor in Europe. Germany had voluntarily said that we would not indulge in arms trade elsewhere. Now this is a clear case of double standards. If you see the figures of the German exports of arms to various countries, you would see that they have been exporting arms to countries which do not have a particularly good record in human rights. So they have been supplying arms to Egypt, they have been supplying arms to UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc. So it's a whole lot of the first 10 exports. The buyers of German arms equipment is there. So it is not as if the Germans have not been producing military hardware or exporting it. The third interesting part is this, that the war in Ukraine has brought out certain phrases and words which revive very ugly memories of the Second World War. Putin has repeatedly referred to the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, in Kiev. Now, this is ironical because the president of Ukraine is of Jewish origin. He has also been assured of support by the Israelis. He has appealed for support to Israelis, and a large chunk of Ukrainian population is of Jewish origin and Jewish faith, and they when you talk that they are behaving like neo-Nazis, it seems absurd, but it revives memories of the German pogrom against the Jews, violation of human rights, genocide during the Second World War. So these memories revive, and Germany has to bend backwards to prove that its policy is not doing something which is anti-Jewish against Ukraine. It cannot afford to antagonize Putin's Russia very much, but the problem remains. There also are old historic memories of the Second World War when Germany pushed across Poland, pushed across Austria, and headed on a march towards Russia. So the memories of the scorched earth policy which the Russians followed to defend their own territory, which is being done by the allegedly neo-Nazi Ukrainians led by the Jewish President Zelensky, have a parallel with what had nightmarish memories of the Second World War. So Germany has to tread a very delicate balance between what it does. Germans had also displayed their unhappiness about the NATO forces being moved from their borders to Polish borders, because that was where the red line of the front threatened had moved in Europe from Germany to Poland, from Central Europe to Eastern Europe, and this is not likely to change in near future. The pressure of refugees, almost 3 million, which have migrated from Ukraine to Poland, to Hungary, to Belarus, even to Belarus, or even some heading even towards the eastern part of Ukraine and maybe to their kinsmen in Russia, is a very tricky situation where the way Europe has treated the refugees is very different because of racial reasons, because of religious reasons, because of the shared cultural values reasons, then it has been treating refugees from other parts of the world. So this is something which again we have to keep in mind. The German people are not very happy about the open arms policy which Angela Merkel had about refugees, and other European countries adjacent to Germany had also been very apprehensive that this was going to open the floodgates of people who were threatening the European civilization. Their national cultural identities were a challenge to their religious identities, practices, and the way of life, standard of life. So it is not easy to share your prosperity with poorer people, refugees, even if they belong to the same racial stock as you do. And this is a problem that Germany is also going to face, because Germany has also had a difference of opinion with the rest of the members of the European Union about economic development. As we mentioned again and again, that it is the largest economic unit in the European Union, and it thinks that accepting the euro had always been an adverse deal for it. Its mark has not been able to leverage its strength in the international market, and it has been forced to bear the load of the ill-performing, sluggish, lethargic members of the European Union, whether it's Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, or any other country. So this complex of challenges has aggravated, not that they did not exist before the Russian military intervention in Ukraine, but afterwards all these have become a lot more explosive. There has been some cases of Islamophobia in Germany. There has been some new Nazi skullheads raising their heads. So there is a temper of intolerance in Germany, and all this is going to be aggravated. Now, while this is happening, the policies of France, which we shall discuss some other time with you, seem to pose a direct challenge to Germany, that it might assume the leadership of the European Union or the European response towards Russia, because Macron is faced with an election in a coming days, coming months, and he might like to project an image of a tough European leader who also can talk to the Russian president at a level, despite humiliations being heaped on him, more maturely, more responsibly. We'll come to that a little later. He's more active on the international arena, but Germany has a difficult task. This brings us to the most important question: how does India react to whatever is happening? As far as the Germans are concerned, India ranks very low in their priority of main economic partners. As far as India is concerned, India also doesn't have Germany as one of the prime targets because India has put its priorities in European Union, and it also has deals with countries like France, like the military deal on Rafale jets. So the time when Indians were dependent on German technology, whether it is pharmaceutical, dyes, chemicals, automobiles, is past. So there is a legacy of past, but I do not think that neither for Germany or for India, either country is of prime importance. So Indians can let the Germans decide their course of action, and we keep watching whatever is happening in the European battlefront and decide our own course of action. The Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India recently is of great importance. Kishida came to India and promised immediately as a goodwill gesture that Japan would extend an aid package of US $45 billion in the next 5 years to India to develop its infrastructure and to have projects of mutual benefit. Japan, even before this, even when Shinzo Abe was the Prime Minister and when Modi had cultivated a special relationship with him, had promised a package of another US dollars, almost 43 billion over the 5-year period, and India has benefited greatly from some of this. It is not entirely without irritants. The Japanese at times have been worried about the sluggish implementation of these project programs, cost overruns. They have been unsatisfied with the implementation, tardy implementation of some of these projects. But at the same time, while there might have been slow progress on the bullet train program, on the Delhi-Bombay corridor, but India has benefited because of quality control standards of the Japanese and its transparency of these programs. So there's one part. But what is even of greater significance is that the Japanese Prime Minister made an explicit statement that the Japan and the Quads understands India's position about the Russian intervention in the war in Ukraine. Now, Japan took some time to begin with, but it has come up explicitly criticizing the Russian conduct in Ukraine. The other members of AUKUS, Australia and United States of America, obviously are spearheading the barricading, having the cordon sanitaire against Putin's Russia. So India is the only odd member out of Quads. So it is first of all difficult to imagine that how the Japanese Prime Minister was talking for all of Quads, but what he said is of importance, because when the joint statement was issued after the meeting of the two Prime Ministers, he also said, for us in Quads, the primary focus remains the South China Sea, the northern part of the Japan Sea and the Pacific Rim, which means that the reason for the main objective for the establishment of Quads was to contain, countervail China in this region, and nothing on the European theatre matters for our national interest as it does within the Quads grouping. But also one cannot overlook that as far as the strategic part of the Quads relationship was concerned, it was marginalized the moment the Americans came out with AUKUS. So the AUKUS is there, which is an Anglosphere countries, the Anglo countries looking after the strategy, and Quads has been delegated the leftover things like climate change, vaccine diplomacy, international terrorism, cultural exchange, and fostering economic relationship between them, transfers of technology, etc., which are comparatively low priority, low immediacy issues in international relations. But another interesting thing is there, when the Japanese Prime Minister was explicitly criticizing Russian intervention in Ukraine, the Indian Prime Minister kept quiet, but when the joint statement was issued, the Indian Prime Minister said that all parties should work towards a peaceful settlement and the end of violence and hostilities in Ukraine. So India has not changed its stance, but India is certainly not going to be drawn into condemnations of Russia, because India has kept its options open. India has also initiated and mooted the question of rupee-ruble trade if the dollar exchange is not possible, because India's security interest, even in the South China Sea, in the Indo-Pacific region, depend to a very large extent on the military hardware it imports from Russia. It is not that it is dependent for 50% of its military hardware from Russia. The aircraft carrier, the submarines, the long-distance missiles, The fighter bombers which can have missiles, launch missiles for hundreds of kilometers, can only be provided, have only been provided by Russia, and the transfers of technology of these weaponaries makes us dependent on Russia. Not only what we buy in future, India in past has tried to diversify its resources. We have bought Rafale fighter jets from France, we have bought a lot of inventory from Israel, but the fact remains that for coming number of years, many years, we will be dependent for repairs, spare parts, and coordination of our officers training, joint exercises with Russia. So as far as we are concerned, we are very wary of the situation where the economic sanctions on Russia will throw Russia into a tighter embrace with China. It will become more dependent on China for its export of gas. It might even have to do it against yuans if the dollars are denied, and this would be not very favorable for India. So if we keep this in mind, the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India makes 2 points. That A, people understand India's nuanced foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. They also understand not only our dependence on Russian military hardware, but the long history of time-tested relationship with Russia. And once this happens, once we rebuild forged relationship with Russia, which in the past few years had become slightly weaker than what it had been in past, our own national interest is going to be further better. There is no reason to believe that Australia or USA or Japan would not follow in a similar hard-nosed fashion, hard-headed manner, their own national interests. The Japanese are worried about Chinese adventurism through their proxy North Korea. What might happen on the Korean Peninsula interests Japanese very much. What happens in Taiwan interests them very, very, very much. And similarly, Australia's dependence on China for its exports, for a time being they can shift it to other countries, but will it be long-lasting in coming years is something which we have to keep in mind. So India is very keen to forge closer relationship with Japan, but when it comes to the crunch, Japan, Russia and China are not exactly in the same league. So India has to very delicately balance its relationship with China and Russia with whatever it does in Quads. While all these events have been taking place in the European war front, in the South China Sea, renewal of diplomatic activity, dynamism between India and Japan, much has been happening in our immediate neighborhood. And what has been causing some apprehensions is the no confidence motion that is confronting Imran Khan in Pakistan. So far, no elected Prime Minister of Pakistan has completed his full term. So people are speculating that is the jinx going to be broken by Imran Khan, or is he also going to be ousted? Imran Khan, let's not forget, was considered as army's candidate, became the Prime Minister with the army's support, and has survived despite all the challenges due to army's support. Now, there are two things which we must make clear here. There are several people who are unhappy in Pakistan with Imran Khan. They think he is much too elitist. They think he is much too glamorous. They think he is much too flamboyant. They think that he doesn't care about the common people. He is worried about his own international image and his own projects of philanthropy, etc., which has been implementing in his own country. His party, Tehreek-e-Insaf party in Pakistan, doesn't really have a massive base, and it doesn't have a historical tradition like either the Muslim League, Nawaz Sharif, or the other faction, or the Pakistan People's Party in Sindh. So there is no geography which he controls as his base. That's one part. But the point is that as long as the army supports him, there is no way he can be ousted. Now, what is the cause of dissatisfaction with Imran Khan? No charges of corruption have been leveled at him. He's been charged with economic mismanagement. Now, if you look at the economy of Pakistan, no elected leader in Pakistan can decide what the course of economic development in Pakistan would be. Pakistan was controlled throughout the Cold War by 22 elite families and small coterie of ruling elite, which had close ties with crony capitalists and the army generals, and they have been they have been recipients of large scale of foreign assistance during the Cold War from America, from Islamic nations, and the person who milked both sides with great brilliance was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who got the assistance from Islamic nations to make an Islamic bomb after the liberation of Bangladesh. He played the victim card, that how India had torn asunder Pakistan, broken it into two parts, because it did not want an Islamic nation on either of its flanks. Also, circumstances in international milieu helped the Pakistani rulers. First, there was the Cold War, and Pakistan became a member of the military alliance system of the United States. Then there was a Russian occupation of Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis were considered to be strategically very sensitive in this context. So the Americans have been pumping in foreign aid, and most of this foreign aid has been cornered by the armed forces, and the armed forces have diversified into industry, into other money-making activities. Not that they have successfully managed the economy, but this has been the ruin. Pakistan has become a sort of a rentier client state. Pakistan has suffered from massive corruption, and this is the kind of thing where Pakistanis, the people were sick of it. There were big landlords, but there was no land reforms. Their minorities were mistreated, but they continue to be mistreated. This is what led to the emergence of Bangladesh. This was the kind of assertion of Sindh under Bhutto's. But then again, Bhutto was not exactly the most democratic of leaders also. He belonged to a ruling elite, an exceptionally rich family, and he also, played foul when he became an elected leader. Now, all these things have to be kept in mind for two interesting reasons. After the defeat in the Bangladesh war, 1971, the Pakistani army was discredited. But this was only for a very short while. Very soon, the Pakistani army and the intelligence agencies bounced back to power. That is because of infighting, megalomania, corruption, feudalism, dynastic ambitions of the elected leaders, whether it's the Bhutto family or whether it's Nawaz Sharif's family. Now, if you keep all this in mind, we seem to be having a replay of this with poor Imran Khan this time in the seat of power. So the economic mismanagement is not all of Imran Khan's doing. But Imran Khan has had to humiliate himself to get loans, bailouts from China, to do China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to become a member of the One Belt, One Road initiative, try to get money from Saudi Arabia and other countries. But because of the turmoil in the Middle East, the people who came to ready aid of Pakistan, like Libya and others, are no longer there. And because Saudis have also tried to diversify their relationship. The relationship between India and Saudis and Emirates has improved. Imran Khan cannot take for granted that this supply of dollars would come. Similarly, the Americans are not in a mood after their retreat from Afghanistan, although some behind the curtain aid will keep coming to the army and to the intelligence agencies, but Pakistan's dependence on these crutches of foreign aid, and it almost is like a dependent parasite, has sucked Pakistani economy dry of any vitality or life. So Imran Khan is faced with this, but the fact remains the prices have risen. Law and order situation in the bordering areas in Peshawar, Rawalpindi and in Sindh is pretty bad. Organized gangs are there, minorities are not safe, the blessed family laws have been misused, there have been terrorist attacks, and it's difficult to say that Pakistan is a victim of terrorism. It is a victim of terrorism of its own creation, like the Frankenstein's monster, but the fact remains. So there's one part. So what is happening at the moment in Pakistan is that Imran Khan is slowly losing control of his own party. So there is dissidence. People find him very aloof, and the coalition is even more threatened. The supporting parties are in a mood to revolt. There is a law in Pakistan where Imran Khan can expel the members of his own party, but there is a grey area. Can he do it to the other members of the supporting coalition parties? They will go to the court, of course, and he can remain till the courts decide this challenge installed in power, but that can only happen when the army plays along with him. Now, army at the moment is trying to project an image that is neutral. If Imran Khan can prove his support, they are with the democratic forces. Otherwise, they are not interfering in it. They have given a new lease of life to ambitious politicians like Nawaz Sharif and his Muslim League Nawaz Sharif faction, etc. Interestingly, what Imran Khan is also allegedly doing is to play one faction of the army with another faction. He is trying to say that can Bajwa be gotten rid of? Can the ISI chief be encouraged to step into his shoes? So now, can the corps commanders in the Pakistani armies, who in past have been together to stem any challenge from the elected government, can be broken into different factions? Can one trust on their loyalty and support? Let's get back to Bhutto. Bhutto thought that he'd appointed a puppet like General Zia in power, and he paid for this mistake with his life. He was judicially executed. So I think this mistake should not be made by any elected leader in Pakistan, that they can play one faction of army with another faction, and the person once installed as the chief of the army staff will remain a loyal supporter of the elected representative. There is no influential enough civil society in Pakistan. In General Iftikhar Chaudhry's period, there were hopes roused that the judiciary might play an activist role, but that also, these hopes have been belied. So whether it is media, whether it is judiciary, ultimately the buck stops with the army. So Imran Khan's fate depends on how the army decides to either prop up another rival in place of him or let him stay in power and be even more pliable. What are the implications for India? Whether Imran Khan stays in power or gets out of power, Pakistan is poised for a period of instability, political unrest, social anxiety, and in this, it is always easy to point fingers outside to an enemy without who's making life difficult for you. Afghanistan remains in turmoil, things there are in a flux, and in fact, Pakistan is going to face the brunt of the instability in Afghanistan as well. There have been incidents of insurgency in Balochistan, and some Chinese advisors, etc., have been targeted and killed in the difficult areas where this corridor runs through. China-Pakistan economic corridors run through. So Pakistan is going to be a problem for India, a headache, if they say, if you might like to think so, because we wish Pakistan well. But there is no chance that Pakistan can get back on rails all by itself. And it doesn't seem that the Americans, the patrons, or the Chinese patrons are going to let Pakistan alone. They, for their own geopolitical interests, their own interests of international power manipulation, would like to use Pakistan as a pawn, which is not good at all for India. So there was a talk for a long time for confidence building measure, whether it's Kartarpur corridor, whether it's resumption of cricket matches, if not in Pakistan, in Dubai, whether there should be people-to-people contacts. Unfortunately, the flamboyance of Imran Khan has also created some problems in diplomacy. He landed in Moscow the day the Russians had started their invasion in Ukraine, and he came out with the tactics and marks in exciting times to be in Russia. So what was it? Was it a loose slip of the tongue, or was it a tacit support of what the Russians were doing? And people expected that when he visited China during the Winter Olympics, that he would come back with some solid gifts from China. So China talked of ironclad relationship with Pakistan, but gains were not tangible. So Imran Khan has tried to leverage his charisma, his personality as much as he can, but his hands seem to be tied. And this is a problem which India will have to face for many years to come. Another neighbor that has been causing constant concern to India is Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is a country which is our flesh and blood, as has been said by more than leaders on both sides more than once, but it also is a country which causes a special problem for us. Throughout the years of civil war, India's sympathies were transparently on the sides of Tamils in the Jaffna Peninsula, and we constantly talked about the violation of their human rights, and we sort of turned a blind eye as far as the Sri Lankan government was concerned about the aid that the Litte were receiving from their kith and kin in the state next door of Tamil Nadu. So there were clashes between fishermen, the fishermen's boats were abused by smugglers, the Litte trying to escape Chinese forces would come and refurbish their arms and armaments, take sanctuary here, and the deployment of IPKF at the invitation of the Sri Lankan government, but later on created ill wills, and the violence of Litte was such that Premadasa was assassinated, the attack was, life-threatening attack was made on Chandrika Kumaratunge, the airports were destroyed, the tourism industry was destroyed, but all that is a thing of past. But what happened is that when the civil war ended, Sri Lanka was accused of violating human rights, committing war crimes, and was put in a dock. Now, India thankfully restrained itself from criticizing Sri Lanka, and it has also, in the years since the quelling of the violence of Litte, has come to the conclusion that Sri Lanka is also facing a threat of Islamic terrorism. There was this attack during the Easter on a church, and the Sri Lankans were once again faced with the terror attack on their soil. Now, what has resulted in the economic plight of Sri Lanka at this moment is partly this violence. Decades of civil war, then terrorist attacks, then the civil strife continuing after the peace returned, then also the ruling party which emerged, the Rajapaksa family, had close ties with China for the development of their pocket borough in the Hambantota port area. And they're playing the Chinese aid card against the Indians. Although on face of it, the Rajapaksa family repeatedly said that there is no comparison between Sri Lanka's relationship with India and any other country. We are a family. But there are family feuds which divide a family. And in this case, there were significant enough differences which created some irritants. Now, the interesting part is not only that India is a larger country next door, India is sympathetic to one minority in Sri Lanka, which is the Tamils in Jaffna, and the Singhals also are people ultimately of Indian origin, but they had migrated to Sri Lankan island thousands of years ago. Now, the problem is that Sri Lanka has been a part of the Indian consciousness in the sense that it was next door, cultural affinities are there, the linguistic affinities are not there, but ties of religion bind us. It is a Buddhist country. For most Sri Lankans, India is a land of pilgrimage, including the Rajapaksa repeatedly, the family members, the president, earlier ex-president and the president, both have said so. But Sri Lanka has drifted in recent years towards China for economic assistance. And this has been a cause of Sri Lanka getting trapped into the debt burden. So the debt trap of taking money recklessly as a loan from China has resulted in writing off on lease, long-term lease, strategically important territory where, of course, the Chinese claim they're not establishing a naval base, but as long as they have a control of the Hambantota port and the adjacent territory under their control, almost extraterritorial rights on long-term lease, they control the naval maritime routes along this area. Now, Indians have tried to countervail this by getting an entry into the Colombo port upgradation project, at times with Japanese assistance, but not with great success. Some resumption has taken place right now. Now, what we must talk about the present plight is this. Sri Lanka has been facing an economic emergency for almost more than a year. In February of the year, their foreign exchange resources were close to $7.58 billion. Within months, in November, December, the foreign exchange reserves had fallen into $1 billion. They were almost on the verge of default of their debt servicing interest cycles and repayment of the mortgage national sovereign loans, bonds. Now, they took another loan, US dollars 1 billion from Chinese to get them bailed out, which put them under even greater debt burden of the Chinese. The Indians have been wary of this. The Indians have been conscious of this. They have been generous to Sri Lankans. They have also extended a line of credit of $1.5 billion. They have given out a bailout of $1 billion US dollars. There is also a currency swap agreement. But how long can Sri Lankan government can manage its foreign exchange reserve crisis from one swap to another swap, one bailout to another bailout? Now, the recent news items have been very distressing. Earlier, there was shortages of fuel, shortages of milk powder, shortages of chemical fertilizer, shortages of food grains, partly because COVID hit the greatest foreign exchange earner of Sri Lanka, tourism industry, very badly. International transport system went haywire and Sri Lankans stopped getting foreign exchange. Unfortunately, things have not improved because if Sri Lankans cannot have foreign exchange enough to pay for its fuel? How do they ply their buses, motors, supplies? How do they generate electricity? There have been major power cuts. Why does a tourist go to a country like this, which is beset with all kinds of shortages, distresses, and so on? Medicines are in short supply. The Sri Lankans were forced to declare an economic emergency, impose rationing, put a general in charge of this. But the recent news items are even more distressing. It has had to postpone its board examinations because most state governments could not, district administrations could not buy paper to print question papers on. So it is going to throw their educational system totally haywire. Prices are skyrocketing. There is great unrest, and they are trying to experiment with organic farming, hasn't succeeded. So all this is a spiraling, snowballing effect, and Sri Lanka doesn't seem to be in a position to bail itself out of this trouble. Now, again, India, how much can India do when it is trying to get its own COVID-hit economy back on rails to help out this neighbor? Obviously, India must do all it can, like it did for the Vaccine Maitri program. It has been generous in providing lines of credit. It also has been brought to the headlines recently that the Sri Lankans who were reluctant to ask for a bailout from IMF have now agreed to request IMF to bail them out of this, which means the situation is really, really very, very grave. There is no chance that even if tourism revives, Sri Lankans can get back to economic health very soon. There is an issue of economic mismanagement which they will have to confront. This is all we have for you this time, and I think it's an interesting mix which we have discussed. There is concern about how Germany and European Union are going to respond to the continuing unraveling of the war in Ukraine, how they are going to protect their own individual interest and strategic autonomy, separate their diplomatic response to Russia from what the Americans want them to do, how effective is NATO going to be after it's been exposed that it is all talk and no claw and teeth. The President Biden made it very clear that America was not going to risk a nuclear confrontation with Putin. And once you make a statement like this, what remains of the joint response? You have massive military deployment in Norway, in Sweden, in European countries. You mount military exercises, but this is only optics. As long as people know that the Americans are not going to put boots on the ground, they are reluctant to declare a no-fly zone, then each country is looking after its own interests, and that's exactly what Germany is doing. But that is what should not cause us very great concern, because Germany, as we discussed, is not at the top of priority of our strategic, economic, or even cultural relationships in international arena. Far more closer relationship we probably have with France and other European countries. Then we discussed Japan, and we have this relationship with Japan where we have a very time-tested, mutually beneficial, trusted relationship with Japan. But are we going to use Quads as a foundation to reinforce these bilateral relationships, or we will also see that there are limits to coincidence of interest in international perspective, but will still manage bilateral relationship with great foresight and restraint? That is something which we must keep in mind. We have to look towards the immediate neighborhood. Portents are not very good. Both in Pakistan, the political instability seems to stare us in the face, and Sri Lanka is tottering on the verge of economic disaster. Neither is very good for India and Indian national interest. Other things have been happening elsewhere. The Iranian nuclear deal is meeting a stalemate. But we shall discuss all this next time when we meet, when things are a little more clearer about both the battle in Ukraine and the stalemate in Vienna about Iran. Till then, thank you and goodbye.